I'd like to welcome everybody to the Gulf Intelligence Halftime Talk, where every week we take a moment in the middle of the trading week to take in a stock on everything that's been going on in the energy markets and take a little bit of an outlook of what may be coming up next. I think this week there seems to be only one story in town, and that is whether OPEC and all of the major oil producers in the world will indeed come together around some major, unprecedented, massive oil supply cut. We're very honored this week to be joined by Dr. Al-Hajji, Managing Partner of Energy Outlook Advisors from Texas. It's great to be able to get, last week we had Vitol, and this week it would be great to have the insight from America, and particularly what the impact all this is having on shale producers. So Dr. Anas, welcome.
Thank you.
Halftime Talk, and also very keen to hear, maybe starting, given the news that's bouncing all around us, what your own outlook is for the possibility of this great new deal that the world's biggest oil producers are currently trying to cook together.
Well, the situation is like this. The amount of the cut they are planning to cut is relatively small, given the major drop in demand. So whether we have the meeting or not, whether we have the cut or not, for the short term, it really does not matter. And President Trump and several senators from the oil-producing states have done a big mistake by putting all their eggs in one basket and blaming Saudi Arabia and Russia for what happened to oil prices and for the suffering of the shale industry. That was a big mistake on their part. They are going to be shocked when they are going to realize that oil prices will remain low, and the cut on Thursday, even if we are talking about 10 million barrels a day of true cut, and I say true because I'm going to explain why some of it is not true. Even if we have this 10 million barrels a day of true cut, we have a serious problem. Prices are not going to rise enough to save shale. And then they are going to realize that, okay, Saudi Arabia cut production, Russia cut production, everyone else cut production, but prices remain low. Whom you are going to blame now? They already went on steroid to blame those countries. Now there is nothing. Those countries are cutting production. What would they do tomorrow when Saudi Arabia cuts export to the United States and do not reduce their OSP prices to the United States, which means that they make it equal to WTI without any discount? Whom they are going to blame now? So there is a major problem here. And the cut, whether we have it or not, it's really irrelevant. However, the market is going to rally around the cut. And if the general sentiment, because of lower cases of coronavirus in the United States, is going to lead to a rally on Wall Street, oil is going to rally with it because of demand, not because of the cut. And I think
if we take this triangle, Russia, Saudi Arabia, United States, who's the kind of three principal pillars of this current initiative, we clearly have the history of Russia and Saudi Arabia of the last few years, OPEC plus, finding consensus to support the market, but we've never had the US participate. What does that perspective from the US look like? Is there a real sense that this is something tangible, that the US even legally is allowed to participate in such a thing?
Well, legally, basically, companies are not allowed to collude, but US officials, whether from the federal government, from the states, or from the Texas Railroad Commission, are allowed to participate, and they classify it as fact-finding mission. So legally, they can attend. However, I think for President Trump, what they are going to do is they are going to claim the shut-in that already happened, whether in shale or others, as the cut. So they are not going to cooperate on additional cut, but they will say, okay, whatever being cut, that's our portion of the cut. Let me rephrase it in a different way. The meeting is going to be very tough and difficult, not because it is always difficult to deal with Russia and other countries in non-OPEC, simply because we have new participants who never participated before, including the US and Brazil and others. The issue here is those who are participating in the meeting with full authority, and I say full authority because there are those participants who are just watchers. Those who are participating with full authority, they are faced with three major questions. The first question is, what is the base of the cut? Are you going to start from April production, or are you going to look at the average of the first quarter? The Saudis prefer to count April because they already increased production, and that increase is going to be counted as part of the cut. The Russians basically prefer to count the whole quarter and look at the average, because in this case, the Saudis will cut even more, and the Russians would love that. So we have this dispute among members on what is the base for the cut. The second question they need to answer is, and related to our earlier discussion, is what is a cut? What is the definition of a cut? Do we include the shut-in as a cut in this case? Do I count my planned growth of production in 2020 that I'm not going to do as a cut? Or are we going to distinguish between production and supplies? If I put my oil in storage, if that's going to be counted as a cut? So I think there will be all kind of games played.
It doesn't seem like we have the kind of time for that endless nuance. This is going to have to be a lot simpler, I would think, in order to get an agreement.
Correct. So I will get to that point in a minute, because this is kind of very interesting point that once we get to that. The third question is, what is the duration of the cut? Is it for 60 days, 90 days? It is to the end of the year. This is extremely important for the following reason. If it is only for 60 days, for example, it will have no impact on the market except some short rally on Wall Street. If it is to the end of the year, then it's going to have tremendous impact on the medium term, because as the number of coronavirus cases decline and the economy around the world starts picking up, then this cut is going to be effective. But it's not going to be the 10 million, because if it is based on April and it is based on what's already being cut, it's based on storage, it's based on all those things that we talked about, then the actual cut probably is about 5 to 6 million, which is very small. But if this continues even 5, 6 million to the end of the year, it will have tremendous impact toward the end of the year. But what is really the game here? The game here, we can look at it this way. The whole meeting happened because of political pressure. It is really at the end a political decision. To participate in the meeting, especially on the part of the United States.
Where's the pressure coming from?
It's mostly the United States and the Trump camp. And the reason why, because those senators in the Senate, whether they are right or wrong, I think they are wrong in their approach by blaming the wrong entity, and they are not focusing on the major issues. It is the pressure from the senators. We are in an election year. Texas is the grand prize right now between the Democratic candidate and Trump. And if Trump loses Texas, it's over.
Do you think there's actually a chance that the Democrats could take Texas?
Well, there are people who are saying that. A lot of people are really angry because they lost their jobs in the oil industry and nothing being done about it. And how they are going to vent their anger, we don't know.
Right.
People do not, especially those who are outside the United States, do not know that Texas experienced the highest population growth in recent years in the United States because of migration from other states, mostly from California. So the number of Democrats increased in Texas cities substantially in recent years. And that might tip the balance if this is the case. We will see how it's going to go. But a lot of people are angry right now because the Trump administration have done nothing to the shale industry. When President Trump talked about lower gasoline prices and it's good for us and it's good for America, that really angered a lot of people in Texas because they felt that they've been, in a sense, hanged on the rope because Trump wanted lower gasoline prices.
When you think about this, if we rewind a little bit from the incentive of Trump to take this political action and the pain that is being felt in Texas, uh, that this has been a sort of long time in the coming, if you like, that the shale oil revolution over the last decade has benefited essentially from the efforts of the OPEC in particular, but others to support an oil price for their own interest, but also the
Yes.
benefit, the fallout from that was that shale was able to really take off under an elevated price. Before this crisis, obviously, the COVID crisis is on one corridor, and then we have the oil supply market share battle between Russia and Saudi, and causing or triggering this price collapse. But where was shale before this happened, and how vulnerable was it to any kind of disruption like this?
Well, I blame OPEC and its members squarely for this, not because they increased prices, simply because they ignored shale. And they were warned in 2011 and 12 and 13 to pay attention to it and to reduce prices, because prices were about 100 and 110 because of the Arab Spring. And they've been warned not to cut production and increase production to lower prices to 75. And they insisted that they want the minimum at 90. The problem is, and I'm telling you a true story without naming names or mentioning countries. I was at dinner tables when senior officials were talking in 2010 and 2011 about Israeli CIA conspiracy of shale. I'm not kidding. They really thought that was something fake news, that just a conspiracy. That was the view. And then they woke up at the end of 2014. So it took them 5 years to realize the impact of shale. In a sense, like they went through the 5 stages of kind of mourning and grieving until they got to the point at the end of 2014 that they need to do something. But I would like to mention something important here for the viewers, because I think they should realize that while all the focus is on oil and shale, oil is only part of the story. And the reason why, because the Gulf nations and other OPEC members took strategic decisions over 3 decades or 4 to invest in energy intensive industries like petrochemicals, based on the idea that ethane is very cheap and natural gas is very cheap in those countries. And therefore they can build those petrochemical plants until Saudi Arabia became the largest producer, the largest exporter of petrochemicals. And it worked fine for them. They were able to compete with anyone else. And again, because of the idea of energy intensive industries, they adopted refining. So they invested in those mega refineries that cost billions of dollars. And then they started producing petroleum products for exports. Then they focus on NGLs because NGLs are not included in the OPEC quota. And there was a premium for it in Asia, so they did that. And then the fourth one, basically for the Gulf nations, they realized that most of the demand for crude was in Asia, and they did focus on Asia, and there was this kind of Asia pivot in terms of...
And do you think that was a mistake?
Well, it wasn't a mistake, but here is the problem with what happened. So they took those 4 strategic decisions, and it worked fine for them until shale came online, and it hit every single strategic decision. On the petrochemical side, ethane, they call it ethane in Arabic. Ethane is abundant in the United States and extremely cheap. Gas is abundant and cheap. In fact, we got negative prices for it. Refining, basically because of the export ban that we had between 1974 and 2015. I'm sorry, I have some allergies, so I have to wipe my eyes here. We have this export ban between 1974 and 2015 that created a big differential between WTI and Brent. Sometimes it reached like $18. And US refiners had a feast on cheap supplies from the United States during that period. And they started exporting gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and all other products to the world. And they made a fortune out of that. So that's the second strategic objective of the Gulf nations that's been hit. On NGLs, we have more NGLs than ever. NGLs prices in the United States right now are at 1/3 their original price.
But in the second 5-year period of the last decade, the price came off, obviously, over the last 5 years.
Absolutely.
And shale started to get increasingly under pressure. How significantly wounded were they before this crisis started in order to have the depth of pockets to survive this crisis?
Sure. So Russia, in the last meeting of OPEC Plus on the 5th and the 6th of March, missed the point because they thought they need to slow down shale, and they did not realize that shale was already slowing down without anything. And it is slowing down exactly because of those reasons. Natural gas prices are extremely low. NGLs prices are extremely low. And shale in general comes, in most places, comes with a larger portion of gas and NGLs than conventional oil. And some wells basically are really gassy, which means that in some areas in Texas, about 40 to 45% of what comes out of the well is natural gas and NGLs. So as a producer, you have destruction of value for about 45% of your BOE. That's number one. Number two, the 55% that we got there is light sweet, super light, and condensates that US refiners do not want anymore because there is no more capacity to handle it, so they have to export it. And that's where Trump and some senators missed when they said we are going to impose tariff on imports, on oil imports from Saudi Arabia, Russia, and others if they don't have a deal. The problem is there is no exports from shale, or the level of exports is going to decline substantially. That's going to be backed out, whether you have tariff or you don't. And therefore, shale producers are going to suffer under any regime because that extra production has to be exported. We're talking about 3 to 3.5 million barrels that US refiners cannot handle. And
are the other aspect that seemed to give shale a lot of cover? Not only was the fact of the OPEC elevating the price, but also shale seemed to have an endless supply of credit lines. The banks and the private equity firms are more than happy to throw money at them, even though the ROI, the return of investment, has never seemed to really materialize. Is that tolerance from the lending, the credit line, still there?
Historically, yes, but this stopped about a year and a half ago, and that's why, and simply because of natural gas and NGLs. So that money is not there, but there are some private equity there with about $80 to $90 billion right now. They are shopping around. So we still have some money for investment at this case. But I would like to point out a very important point here. There are a lot of talk and articles out there about how shale is not profitable and how shale is cash flow negative and they cannot survive, etc. There is a big hole in this argument. The big hole is the following. The shale revolution came in from medium-sized and smaller producers, not from the oil majors. Private equity played a major role here. What people missed is the following. If I am a private equity and I get a team and I give them 50 million or let's say $100 million to go and get it and buy producing assets, expand them, so I can sell it to the bigger fish. So I spend 100 million, they expanded reserves, they expanded production, cash flow is negative, first year, second year, third year. So it's all negative cash flow. But the value of the assets jumped from 100 million to 300 million. Now I'm going to sell it to the bigger fish. So I'm going to sell it to the bigger fish for 300 million. Once I sell it, people are not going to see the 300 million anymore. It's not going to appear anywhere.
Well, we saw Occidental do a bit of that with Anadarko, and they got pretty burnt.
Well, that's recently, but historically, especially if you look at 2014, people made a fortune
Right.
out of that. So
But
the idea
now, when
here,
we look at the condition of shale, already wounded coming into this crisis, how damaged are they, regardless of what happens this week with OPEC Plus?
it is very, it's like really damaged and wounded lion in a sense. And the pain is tremendous. And whether OPEC agreed to a cut or not, the biggest story of the year after Corona is the forced cut around the world, including shale and oil sands in Canada and others. This is really the biggest story. It's not the demand anymore, it is the amount of decline. And shale production right now is dropping like a rock. And based on the information we have right now, if storage around the Houston gets full by the end of this month, even the best producers with the lowest cost have to shut down. So it's no longer about the highest cost and inefficient producers and companies with high debt. We are talking about very efficient producers.
Well, that will be the same. That will be the same in the Gulf, right? I mean, Saudi Arabia and UAE and everybody else will no longer be able to sell their oil, especially the extra barrels they've introduced in April, because the storage will be full everywhere and the demand would not be there. Let's just come to finally the closing sense of this conversation. What's your outlook for the rest of the week? Obviously, in particular, the meeting, the non-meeting, the very large video conference. I think in some ways the market seems to be just relieved that a lot of countries are coming together to agree on anything. In this great COVID crisis, we haven't seen any real global leadership. Here there is, around the oil story at least, some consensus emerging. Whether it happens or not, I don't know. What's your opinion? How do you see the rest of this week playing out?
Well, a couple of things here. The first one is the oil market is going to rally regardless, because they believe something is going to come out of this, until people find out the truth that this is a production that cannot be sold anyway, and then
so
prices
is this
will
a
decline.
buy on the rumor, sell on the news setup?
Yes, that's number one. And if the number of cases of corona cases basically decline in the United States in the coming days, and people will look at it as this is a good sign, and demand will start picking up, so prices will go up. But I think if there is any support to prices in the coming weeks, it will come from the demand side, not from the supply side.
So you think that this large group of countries, quite competitive even within OPEC, never mind outside of OPEC, can actually come to an agreement around 10 million barrels?
I think it's very easy to get to 10 million simply because of the large amount of unsold oil. But I would like to mention one point here. The benefits to Saudi Arabia from this meeting are huge, and especially the political benefits, because it elevates the political pressure on them, probably erase it completely, while they can show that they are cutting production for the unsold oil. But the main point here is, by President Trump calling the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia and calling Putin and asking them to cut, he really killed in OPEC in the Senate. No one can go back to that in OPEC that allows, if it passes, it allows US prosecutors basically to prosecute OPEC members for antitrust violations if they meet. That's no longer anymore.
So when we look at the rest of the week, we have the OPEC Plus meeting on Thursday, but then we have the G20 on Friday. What do you think the difference or the meaning of those two, the G20, what role does that play in this crisis?
Let's remember that we had a meeting like this in Jeddah in 2008 when King Abdullah invited ministers and others, and we have the Prime Minister of UK basically attending. So this happened before, when we have extreme cases, like at that time oil was at 135. That was a very extreme case, and they met. Now we have the other side. So it's really normal for those countries to meet when you have extreme cases like this. The IEA is heavily involved in this meeting, and therefore it makes sense for other consumers to attend this meeting. Their concern is not only that low prices, their concern basically that those low prices are going to reduce supply substantially, and we are going to end up in energy crisis in 2021 or 2022, and then they have to pay $150 again.
Well, that would be a nice problem to have if you're sitting in Dubai and the United Arab Emirates and
Yes.
any major oil producing country. I have to wrap it up there, Dr.
Sure.
Anas Al-Hajji. Thank you so much for participating in Halftime Talk. And we look forward to seeing you in the Gulf sometime soon. Be safe and take care of yourself during these uncertain days.
You too. Thank you very much.